Werner, Frans, Vance, thank you so much for joining me today. Rewilding is a topic that is very close, I think, to all of our hearts. So I'm excited to talk about it and to dive a little bit deeper into the more scientific angle of rewilding. So, Werner, Peaceparks Foundation has been closely involved in the restoration of multiple ecosystems in southern Africa. What role has rewilding played in all of this?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and it's wonderful to be in the presence of two conservation legends, Frans and Vance, and very happy to have this discussion today. Well, first of all, peace parks have been involved in transboundary conservation areas throughout southern Africa. And the idea is to manage ecosystems as opposed to managing individual protected areas. And many times, the individual protected areas in some of those countries have really been run down or are just a park on paper, on a map. It's not, in reality, if you go there on the ground, you'll find that there's actually nothing there no animals, and the land use even could have changed. So that has been a reality for many of the parks where peace parks became involved, and that's exactly also where you have to focus your effort. So one of the key elements in that process is then to bring the animals back that used to occur there naturally, and then obviously once you do that, to do it in a way that is in line with how it used to be ecologically, and there's very good records over the last 100 years of how many of these protected areas look like. And then over time, in a very structured process, restore systematically the landscape by bringing back all the various species that occur there, and ultimately ending up with trying to get in a functional ecosystem like it used to be, right? So it's quite a process, it's quite expensive. It's not easy, it's extremely difficult, and Peace Parks has been involved in rewilding. I think we're more than 10 parks at this stage. We've moved wild animals from areas where there was an abundance to areas where we were rewilding those protected areas, and 15 different species. And of course, it's not about rewilding only, there's an end game, and the end game is to ultimately not only ensure ecological functioning of the system, but also to have the park generate revenues, because simply put, if there's no wild animals, there's no tourists, and if there's no tourists, these protected areas simply do not have alternatives to generate revenue. So Peace Parks have been really using rewilding as a key cornerstone to rehabilitate protected areas and get the functionality back, also the economic side of it restored.
Frans, living in Africa, it's almost strange to think that you are rewilding Europe. Can you talk us through some of your projects that you are running?
Yeah, well, I can imagine that image that you have from Africa. I've traveled a lot in Africa, and we worked together in Southern Africa for a long time as well. So I'm actually in a nice position to make a comparison. And most people don't know that actually Europe has the largest protected area network in the world. And there's various categories of protected areas, not only national parks or strict reserves. But rewilding is not about improving protected areas. In Europe, it's about bringing a new, if you like, narrative to nature across our continent. A continent which I think is unique in the sense that we see a huge rural depopulation, young people that move away from the countryside, go to cities, and old generations staying behind, with result land abandonment, less pressure on land. Now, tell me any continent in the world where that is happening, and actually it provides huge opportunity and we talk about millions and millions of hectares, and that provides huge opportunities to maybe let nature bounce back a little bit. And if you look at Europe, people grew up in a cultivated landscape, very human dominated, but there's also a lot of nature there that we can work from, and this is the big opportunity, a historic opportunity, I would say, for Europe, to now let nature bounce back. Wildlife is expanding, tremendously on its own. Europe is the only continent where all the large carnivores are coming back, where people have huge interest in wildlife and wild nature, and where the space is now there. And that's basically what Rewilding Europe is building on. All these opportunities are very opportunity driven. And of course, we help nature to come back by creating the right conditions. If you want a river to be able to flood again, you have to take away dikes and dams. We're very good at that in Europe. To also dam removal has become one of the big new things here. But what we are doing, so it's a new vision on nature in Europe, with more space for wild and nature driven by natural processes. And that is really gaining traction because it's also a very cost-effective way of nature recovery. And we're demonstrating this in 9, nearly 10 big landscapes all across the continent, where we are providing the conditions for nature to bounce back, through interventions in the beginning. One of them is bringing wildlife back, but it's only, if you look at the whole suite of things we do, it's only a limited, a small portion, basically. And alongside nature recovery, really invest in the new local economy, because a lot of these areas, you can imagine, where people are leaving, public services are disappearing, the shops closed, the doctor's gone, no children are born in many of these villages and places. And how do you bring new sort of economic activity in that area? And the idea is to not continue like in the past with more intense land use, but actually to build an economy based on the natural values that it provides. So we now have big areas where we work. We're looking at more in the future. And these are sort of iconic landscapes across the continent, different countries, different socioeconomic contexts and geographical landscapes and ecology, where we are demonstrating how rewilding can actually take place at scale in Europe. And we are just 10 years. We're much younger than peace parks. But I think rewilding, 10, 11 years ago, nobody spoke about it in our continent. Now it's all over the place, and everyone is talking about rewilding. Today, just to give you an example, and not only in the conservation sector, today as I got a message that even in the fashion industry, rewilding is now becoming interesting. And so Vogue just presented something new, a new clothing line with one of the top designers in European fashion industry called Rewilding. So, it's just unbelievable. And we are trying to, of course, focus on what Rewilding Europe is about, which is making Europe a wilder place and in the benefit of people, and where wild nature really truly gets a new place in a modern 21st century society.
That is actually so good to hear that rewilding is of interest to other industries as well. Because we all know that the climate breakdown and species loss to extinction is a crisis that is affecting many sectors simultaneously and catastrophically. And we need a solution that can address diverse issues if we want to turn this around. Now, Vance, we know that there is a bridge between climate and biodiversity. So if we were to bring animals back to near historic levels, we have the potential to supercharge climate mitigation. What does that mean?
I like anything that gets supercharged. It's great to be here with these two supercharged guys and their organizations. It's been a great privilege for me to be friends and to work very closely with them, because they're superchargers. And to what you specifically refer, there's an emerging science that's not very well known, but it's getting well documented now. And it's been called animating the carbon cycle. What does animating mean? It means bring to life. It's a wonderful word. In the specific sense that's been developed by Professor Oswald Schmitz at Yale, and now is being investigated by many people. Our Global Rewilding Alliance, we work together, not only us here, but 130 groups around the world. We have 60 experts now working on the impact of wildlife as the missing link in the climate crises. And we're doing that by showing the highly undervalued, very important impact that wildlife of all types, not just the mega wildlife, but all types, crabs, birds, but of course, normal wildlife we would see. Let's take Africa for an example. The wildebeest, or the gnu, as some people call it. We all know these great scenes across the Serengeti or the Mara or whatever. Well, there was a time some years ago where, with the introduction of cattle, cattle-borne diseases came in, the wildebeest populations dropped dramatically. And what happened is the grasses that were normally kept under control grew a lot and became much more fire prone. And as a result, emitted carbon. So those areas became carbon emitters more than carbon drawdown. Well, with very good conservation, the wildebeest population has come back. And as it's come back, the grasses have been kept under, they've been grazed, and their ability to absorb carbon and bring it down into the roots has increased dramatically. So that now science shows us that those areas are now carbon sinks again. And the facts and figures are that when that system operates correctly, and the wildebeest are doing their job, and the zebras are doing their job, and the grasses are doing their job, and the cattle are there, but they're in controlled numbers, okay? People are involved. But when the wildlife is back at near historic levels, the carbon sink capacity of that area is equal to the carbon emissions of Kenya and Tanzania combined. I mean, it's a fabulous factoid that just that one species. And you can talk about this about many other species as well, but I love the word animate. I think what we need to do in rewilding in general is we're looking at reanimating the world, bringing nature and climate together so that people can see it really is one issue. Two existential threats merging into one very existential issue. And the restoration of wildlife and animating the carbon cycle has a major role to play, and setting that right.
It's incredible that the science is proving it like this. And I mean, I'd love to take a little bit of a dive into the process of rewilding and the science behind rewilding. So Werner, can you explain sort of which ecological studies have been done, or has the ecological studies been done when you plan rewilding? And what information does this provide, and what do you do with that information?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, definitely. If you cannot in any of these protected areas go in there without a very good understanding of the landscape prior to doing anything. For example, imagine if you start putting in species there that didn't occur there historically, you can have significant unintended ecological consequences, right? So we always have an ecological study done and to get a very good assessment of what we call the carrying capacity. So what can the park sustain in a sustainable way, or the protected area? And that's your core, and that we'd like to ultimately move towards. And in the case of wildlife, they're designed to optimally utilize nature. And if you think about it, the giraffe being so tall, can as a browser can eat plant material that the zebra or a gnu cannot access. So you can have animal species living really close to each other without being in competition with one another, and that doesn't work with cattle or sheep. I mean, they just are bulk grazers, and they're directly in competition with other cattle, whereas wildlife generally utilizes the entire ecosystem and the entire grazing and browsing component in a much more efficient way. So you would like to be informed what is the ultimate carrying capacity of a park, and usually there's various vegetation types, and that's your scientific base. And then you start off with reintroducing species that are what we typically refer to as your bulk grazer, your plains-game species, and sometimes even soon in the process to bring back elephant. Just like what Vance has described in Serengeti with these hot fires and this fuel load build-up has happened in many parks that we came into. As North National Park is a good example, and it became so thick that other species cannot coexist there. So you need also elephants into the system as quickly as possible as ecosystem drivers, or bringing back a better balance between the grass component and the tree component. So it definitely requires a science-based approach, and it definitely is also dependent on the availability of animals. North National Park, for example, again is 2,000 kilometers from anywhere where there's animals, so it's extremely expensive. So you, for example, with budget availability, want to introduce core population, protect them well, and in this case we put them in a sanctuary, and from the sanctuary release them into a wider population, because you simply can't afford to bring back 20,000 impala. So that plays a role. And the other thing that's also quite important with what we do in Africa with rewilding is you do not put animals back that are endangered, rare, or threatened until you have a really good comfort in the management capacity and the ability to protect those species. So rhino, for example, with this incredibly I think it's probably one of the most trafficked species, the horn in the world. It remains a sought after product, unfortunately, up until today. And if you cannot put in adequate protection, then you simply don't put back rhino. But if you do, and we're actually doing it in a national park now in a new country, you can establish a new core population. So it all depends on where you are in the life cycle of rewilding and rehabilitating a park. It must be science-based, must be extremely conservative. And the other thing that's quite difficult to sometimes appreciate, if you start with predators, we just started putting back cheetah in Maputo National Park, and there's a lot of space in the park, and it's 120,000 hectares, and there's a lot of prey base, but just the nature of the species is that they tend to roam wide, and the fence doesn't stop a cheetah, right? So even if it's electrified, they go through the fence, and we actually lost 2 cheetah quite early on. So it's definitely not easy, and you have to keep on reintroducing cheetah until there's a stable population and the population can start growing. So it's not easy, it's expensive, and it's far more cost effective to rather protect what you have in the existing landscape than after the fact and try to build it to bring it back. Unfortunately, in most cases we are there. And it takes a lot of time, and to have sufficient numbers, build up over time to have an ecosystem coming back to full life and into a full cycle.
Frans, can you explain your scientific-led approach? Is it similar to what Werner explained? Is it different?
I think it's quite different, and we are we work with many scientists and universities from all across Europe, because the science in rewilding is very much emerging. How do you restore an ecosystem bottom up? And maybe as opposed to many of the big areas that Werner's working in Africa, I mean, the physical state of the landscapes that we're working in is quite different. So it starts also with sort of the physical environment itself. It's not only about wildlife, as I said before, but also I think it's important to say that we think we know enough to restore large landscapes. There is no excuse for any scientist to come in and say we don't know what to do. By the way, we don't have the time for that. And I think with all the people that we're working in the scientific world, we have agreed that science can never be prescriptive to rewilding. Rewilding is happening. We need to monitor, we need to learn, we need to adjust. but we're not going to wait for PhD to tell us what to do or what more research we need to have. And I'm not negative about science, not at all. It's critically important, but we are not, and I think that the example that Vance is saying about these new insights, we are, I think, like Peace Parks, very much a practitioner and want to do things on the ground. We know, with the knowledge we have in Europe on our ecosystems, we know where the critical sort of interventions have to take place, and that's what we're doing, and then we learn from that. So it's quite a different approach, but we do have a lot of science happening. And for instance, one of the things that we are looking at, which has been published in Nature, is a new methodology. A lot of monitoring work is looking at species and habitats, which is quite a traditional approach, because ultimately species and habitats are a result of natural processes, isn't it? So we have designed, with a number of scientists in Europe, a new methodology that actually measures natural processes. So it measures the functionality of a system, not if a species is there or not, and how and the numbers of it, because that is a result of a functioning system. And so that has been published, and we have applied it and looked at sort of the baseline back in 2012 compared to 2020. And there was a publication, and it's interesting to see that, in the landscapes that we're working, not all of them, but we start to see impact in terms of, think about a scale of wildness from 0 to 10, where 0 is a parking lot in the middle of London or Johannesburg or wherever, and 10 is pure wilderness, which we don't have in Europe anymore, at least not at scale. And so moving up that scale of wildness, that's basically the process of rewilding, and you can measure that. And whether you move from a 3 to a 5 or a 5 to a 7 or a 7 to a 9, that is all progress, positive progress towards creating a wilder environment with the natural processes, taking a role. So, and we do have PhDs and we do have people and doing lots of analysis, but we don't want science to be prescriptive, because we don't have the time, once again, but also we know enough. There's no excuse to not rewild, because we haven't done enough science on it. So that's our position there, and it's really nice to see that many of the scientists of world-leading, scientific organizations, I'm talking about Oxford or Aarhus, also different places across Europe, that have taken up this sort of open mind and say, yeah, we as scientists, even though we know a lot, we will learn a lot from rewilding, things that we had never thought could happen in Europe. And there's interesting examples of new findings that people didn't think about. So it's exciting, and but we have to move on with the rewilding work itself in the first place.
So, can you give us some examples of where you've seen positive ecological impact, Frans?
Yeah, one of the things that that is quite something, and I'm sure, I'm not so sure about Southern Africa, but one of the things that happened in Europe, so before people came, we had lots of wild herbivores, like you have in your big plains game, you call it. And a lot of those disappeared. We had big number of bison and aurochs and wild horses and deer and you name it. And when people started occupying Europe, some of those species even completely disappeared, or they were pushed back to very low numbers, and domestic grazing took over. And many people, all the land that was occupied came with lots of livestock. And now with land abandonment, with the people leaving big time, also the livestock is disappearing. And you see in many regions in Europe, in particular the more marginal land, mountainous areas, huge recovery of forest. I mean, forest cover in Europe expanded in the last 110 years. There's great animations of that with 23, 25%. And this is because grazing pressure is gone from livestock. People disappeared, livestock is gone, and you see the systems bouncing back. But now without large herbivores. So you could say for the first time in the history of the European continent, we have huge tracts of land that don't have either wild herbivores or the domestic ones anymore, which become huge, shrubs and scrub and young forest without any grazing, which has a negative ecological impact. But also it increases, in particular in this time of climate change, the risk of wildfires. And we see this in particular in the Mediterranean region. So one of the things we're doing there is to bring back large herbivores, wild grazers, that can defend themselves against carnivores, because we have wolf populations are increasing quite extensively in Europe. So we're looking at free roaming wild herbivores that sort of open up the landscape, create those mosaics, and make the landscapes more resilient towards wildfires. And so that's one of the things that we're seeing as an impact of rewilding. And the measurement that was just talking about, that first analysis, we talk impact, of course, takes time to see that happening. Results can happen tomorrow, but impact is a different story. And in 6 of those 8 landscapes that we analyzed, we saw an increase of the wildness index, because we were able to take away some of the human pressure, at the same time create conditions for nature and wildlife to come back and thrive. So we see the first good indications of rewilding starting to happen now.
Werner, how do you balance the ecological aspects of rewilding with the social, economic, and political considerations?
Yeah, it's very complex because I would love to have had France's problems in Europe, where you've got the rural area becoming less populated. In Africa, the population growth is the highest in the world now, and we are, looking at the latest projections, looking at over 2 billion people in 30 years from now, and 20 years from now in Africa, 20 to 30 years, and over 4 billion by the turn of the century. That's by far a higher growth rate than anywhere else in the world, and that has consequences on the rural landscape. You see that in the deforestation rates in Africa. You see that in the increased desertification rates as a result of overgrazing. You do see a definite impact of human growth and development. So we will experience more and more this conflict between wildlife and people. You see, for example, in the Kaza region, Kavango-Zambezi transferred to conservation area between 5 countries with the largest elephant population in the world, over 250,000 animals now. Daily, serious impact between people and those elephants, and they all need the same resources. They're all competing for food and for water. And so if you rewild the park, and we've seen it, if you bring back a lion or elephant, that might not be politically acceptable. In Mozambique, we have a park, Limpopo National Park, and you saw, as you rewilded the park gradually with more herbivores, there was more food, and you had a large number of hyena landscape moving into the system, and a tremendous spike in the conflict between the population living inside and adjacent to the national park. So the way to mitigate that is to look at you have to be really innovative. I think one of the programs that I'm very proud of is called Herding for Health. It's a partnership with Conservation International, and it's an animal husbandry program. So that sounds now quite fancy, but it's actually doing what was done for centuries, where people were herding their livestock, and they were doing so because they were protecting them from predators. And in Africa, most of the areas outside of protected areas do not have predators anymore. And the predators only are where they're fenced and it's electrified and things like that. So if you rewild, you're going into more open systems. You tend to have wildlife moving into those landscapes. Then you have lions moving into their landscapes and hyenas, and they start catching the cattle because it's easier. So the Herding for Health program then came up with a way to employ people to look after the cattle by day while they do science-based rotational grazing. So it's also good for the environment. It's not just having cattle walking all over the place, but it's herding them in much tighter groups and herding them according to a grazing plan, and by night putting them into protective, we call them bomas. I don't know why there's a different word for a boma, but it's a canvas kraal that the cattle go into at night, and it's you can't see through it, and because you can't see it through it, the lion will never jump into an area where they can't see where they're jumping to. So they can smell the cattle, they can hear the cattle, and they will go around it, but they won't go in. So we've taken mortality where we've lost over 1,000 cattle in Limpopo Park in the past 10 years to zero in a matter of 18 months. So there are those solutions where you work hand in glove with community, where it's science-based, where it's employment creation, and where the animals actually are now far more healthy. And suddenly people say, well, maybe it's not so bad to have cattle in the national park, because now you can use them to start as fire breaks, right? Intensive grazing to clear the bush. So and those type of dynamics are something that we didn't foresee before we started with the rewilding program, and now it's become such an essential part of rehabilitating and rewilding these particular areas. Is looking at these solutions where people and nature can coexist in completely different ways, and really trying to give the functionality of the ecosystem priority, and making an effort to get to that point.
So Vance, we've heard two quite different perspectives and approaches to rewilding, and so I'm interested to hear how you think we can animate the carbon cycle on a global scale if it's so diverse, if the approaches are so diverse.
Rewilding needs to be specific to be successful. You've heard both of our friends here say you observe the landscape or the seascape. Let me give an example about the sea, because we're talking a lot about land, because the sea is global. It's 70% of what's going on. And there's so little known about fish stocks, except the fact that most of them are vastly overexploited. But what little is known is the tremendous impact that fish have on the carbon cycle. And let's take the mega fish, the mammal, the whale, right? The work that's been done in this regard is astounding. The amount of how the whales, they come up to breathe, and that's where they have a plume of defecation that feeds the phytoplankton, and that it grows tremendously, absorbing a huge amount of carbon. The whale dives down deep, and the whale itself is a carbon store. And so ultimately the whale dies. They've even put a price on a whale. When the price of carbon was still fairly low about 5 years ago, the International Monetary Fund, Ralph Chalmey, put a price of $2 to $5 million on one whale because of the carbon deal. But more importantly, yes, restore the whales. If we can get big populations going up, 450,000 tons, as much carbon as is emitted in all of Africa. But something that I really think is super important, it's not just the species, it's getting rid of the bottom trawling that's destroying where all that carbon is. It's not only indiscriminate fishing, but it's destroying the seabeds where all the sediments are, and it's releasing carbon. So I think better fisheries management, oceans management, increasing fish stocks. We all know, as conservationists, we all know what happens when they create a fishing exclusion zone. You get an explosion. I mean, the sea rewilds itself quickly. More fish, more food, more microbes. The power of nature to heal itself is amazing. It's astronomical. If we just leave it alone. So that's on a global scale. Let's pay attention to the oceans. Some practices will be different in different areas, but people fish all over the world, and those big commercial fishing fleets need to be brought under control, and that can go a long way towards animating the fish and the whales.
So let's fast forward 15 years down the line. Werner, what do the conservation areas that you're currently rewilding, what do they look like?
Well, I think probably one should say, what will the landscape look like going forward? You know, for me, probably what we're doing now and what Vance is talking about is an understanding of the importance of this balance between nature and humans, right? It's absolutely essential that we understand that we cannot exist without a functional ecosystem. It's impossible, and that's where I hope we'll see, and I'm sure we'll see, far greater awareness. The COVID has actually done us a great service, where finally people are standing to say, aha, there's actually a link between our own health and the health of our planet. So I think from a global perspective, I think we are in a better place now than we've ever been in terms of understanding the importance of our healthy ecosystems. So that will be at a macro level. I think where I'm sure the world is going is this enhanced understanding. That at our level, we also would like to see a far better understanding and tolerance towards ecological linkages, because if we have these isolated protected areas, they still have to be manipulated. They still have to, you have to still have artificial gene flow, or you still won't have. If they cut off, you can get all sorts of ecological challenges going forward. So I would like to really see that there's far better tolerance and understanding and allowance for ecosystem connectivity between core protected areas and other core protected areas. I also see that in 15 years from now we'll probably have much better usage of applied uses of technology, and we refer to the term of smart parks, smart protected areas, and we definitely will probably be far more cost effective in terms of how we look after these natural resources. All of these parks, if you like it or not, will probably be plugged into low Earth orbital satellites, and you'll have real-time protection of your natural resources. So in that regard, in terms of our ability to look after species, and immediately there will be a red flag if there's illegal deforestation taking place. So our life will become far easier with technology, access to information, access to and cheaply so, or for free. And also something that I see a big trend in Africa. And that's something that we've also realized for the past decade or so, is that governance and partnerships, public-private partnerships between NGOs and governments and the private sector is absolutely key to the future of protecting our natural world. So these, so governance models are key to really enable all the sectors and players to take hands and be far more effective and build on the strength of one another. So I see a lot of that improved partnerships and improved governance models taking shape over the next 15 years. So I actually am quite positive. I think in Africa the biggest concern for us is on the negative side is the population growth. But again, if there's education and improved healthcare and improved models to ensure coexistence, like the Herding for Health program, then we are actually in a very good place. So definitely excited about the future. I think we are in Africa certainly seeing a reversal of the trend of species loss in protected areas. Actually, there's so many protected areas now that are on the up and are better managed and better protected. Yes, we are struggling with certain species, and one would like to see that translate into landscapes now, and that's where a lot of the focus will be on the human side and the impact of people and this population growth on these natural systems. So in general, optimistic, but it's going to be it's a critical next 10 to 15 years in Africa. Absolutely critical, and if we can get it right, then I think, and we can maintain ecological functioning and ecosystem services, fantastic. But if we can't, I think then we're in trouble. So I'm optimistic. I'm going for the first, and hopefully all of these additional resources and additional awareness and additional technologies will help us to get there.
Frans, what about Europe? What does Europe's wilderness areas look like in 15 years from now?
Yeah, well, first of all, I explained that wilderness, I think, is 1% left. So we talk about wild nature and different sort of states of wildness. As I said before, we have a few really, positive assets, looking at from the policy angle. So we have the EU Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy. There will be this year, where the European Commission will launch the EU nature restoration law, which puts legally binding targets for member states to restore nature at scale. But also we see a big wildlife comeback happening, particularly from the more larger and more iconic species. A process already going on for decades, and so that wildlife comeback is actually posing people with, so how do we deal now with wolves again after 200 years, or beavers, or bears, or there's dozens of species that are doing very well. And by the way, soon in June we're going to provide a new update on the wildlife comeback in Europe situation. And also, because even though people live more in urban areas, or maybe thanks to the fact that people live more in urban areas, there is huge interest in going out and experience nature and hiking and wildlife watching. So there is a huge business case in wild nature in different ways, in terms of the tourism potential it has, and it's already growing fast, but also in terms of carbon capture. Nature recovery at scale is a huge opportunity for mitigating and adapting impacts of climate change. And in our own landscapes that we have now, 10 will be 15, we'll definitely see nature thrive and wildlife coming back. And as Werner said, coexistence is the way to go. Don't think that you can lock up wildlife in parks with fences. I mean, that's just not the strategy. And I think Europe has a long history in coexistence, because our parks were too small anyway. So you will never have viable populations of many species in the parks only. And there is this example of Italy, where I think there were like 35 or 50 wolves left in one of the oldest parks of Europe, Abruzzo National Park. Italy has now 3,000 wolves, and they're just roaming everywhere. And even though this is not without challenges, there is, I think we have shown that we can live in coexistence with wildlife. So if that is the net result, I'm very positive. I think the biggest challenges in Europe are really about unsustainable fisheries, unsustainable agriculture, unsustainable forestry, and now more and more unsustainable energy production. And this is, where the general biodiversity decline is still happening in Europe. But I hope with our examples of at landscape level of where we try to reverse the trends, and where we can show that there is a future in these landscapes based on other values than the traditional ones. I think those can become, and are already, inspiration for others to adopt the whole idea about rewilding, because we can do beautiful things in the landscapes we work, but ultimately what counts is that others adopt rewilding principles, out of their own genuine long-term interest, not to please Rewilding Europe or whoever, but because they see this is just inevitable for the future. And in that sense, we see huge changes happening over the last year, 1.5 years, in particular with corporates, companies, driven by their shareholders, and because they want to be nature positive in the end. And there's lots of front runners out there that are approaching us, and I'm sure Werner's experiencing something similar, and others, where the private sector's coming in. And I really think that the private sector has to come in big time, because with public support and funding, we're not going to make the big change that we need. And so I see lots of opportunities, and but the challenge is big. It's really big, and but we we believe in a positive narrative. I think the anxiety narrative that is so typical for conservation, it tells people off. People don't like to be part of a losing team. They want to be part of a winning team. And I think by showing the right examples, work with nature, what better ally can you have? Nature will bounce back, as Vance told so well, if we allow it to. And that generates energy and empowerment. It's particular in Europe for the younger generations that have been so angry and are so concerned about their future. There is a way for them. There's hope, there's perspective, by restoring nature at scale for all sorts of reasons, from health to economic benefits to joy in life and all of that. So that's what we're trying to demonstrate. We do our part, but we need to scale up big time. And after the first 10 years of Rewilding Europe, where we have been putting a lot of effort on demonstrating how rewilding can work in practice, which we will continue to do, we now will also, in the next decade of our young life, early journey still, we would like to really look at scaling up and make others adopt rewilding, as I said, because of their own long-term genuine interest. So I'm positive as well. If you're not positive in this sector, you better go and do something else. But we see lots of positive impacts and signs, and they're maybe still small, but they have the potential to become big, and that's what we should be after, all of us.
So, Vance, listening to the hopes and some of the concerns, what do you see? If you look at this from a global picture, what do you see? 15 years down the line, most of the concerns have been overcome, the targets have been met, everybody's living, for nature, with nature. What does your global picture look like?
That's a wonderful question. I need to re-emphasize what both of my friends have said. The need for ambition has never been greater. The need for scale, the need for commitment. And I don't say these things as, all right, get out there, get to work. This is an opportunity, right? When I work with young people, I've got some years on me now, plenty of go left in the tank. But I tell you, I've never been more excited. Why? Because I feel that those here of us and the young people coming on, they are born at one of the most exciting times in human history, because they can save this planet. They were born for this. I mean, that is powerful. I apologize to say that my generation and those before us, a lot of people didn't do a very good job. We got a mess on our hands. It's not going to be easy, as Frans said. But we can do this. I'll give you one example. We work in Mali, one of the poorest countries in the world. It's a war zone. We work to save the desert-adapted elephant, one of only 2 herds of desert-adapted elephants. It's in a landscape full of people, 17 ethnicities, full of bandits and Islamists. It's not easy. It's the UN's most dangerous deployment in the world. Okay? We just worked, our Malian team, it's 100% Malian team, worked with the government for 6 years. And in December, they signed into law an extension of the biggest central game reserve where the elephants are, the Gorma Elephant Reserve. They expanded it to 4 million hectares, one of the poorest countries in the world. Why did they do that? Because they saw the work that our Malian teams were doing there to stop the fire breaks. I mean, to create the fire breaks, create better grass. Cattle were doing better. And guess what? They were seeing more small game return in the grass because it wasn't burning. And they gave the local people, they decentralized their natural resource laws. So local people could control their little woodlands and their water holes. And if transhumant herders came in with big prestige herds and to foul the water, they could tax them. Local people were empowered for their own resources. They want the elephants there. 4 million hectares. It increased the protected area status of the country in one go by 26%. That's one of the poorest countries in the world. So that's what we can look forward to. We need ambition, we need scale, like all of us here are working at, but especially a continental thing in Europe, subcontinental with peace parks. But I end by repeating myself, which I don't like to do often. This is a really exciting time, and we were born for now.
So let me ask you guys this. This is an open question to all three of you. Unfortunately, I don't have $1 million. So I can't contribute on a massive scale. But what can I do? How can I help? How can I help rewild my planet so that my future looks better?
Well, I'll start off and say there is nothing too small that is not important. The power of the small yields the power of the big. Those of us who are enabled to work at scale, we need to go even further, right? But get out in your backyard, in your back garden, plant those plants that attract the butterflies and the insects, because that's rewilding. Do it on your farm, do it in your back garden, get together with your neighbors. Make a whole neighborhood that's insect and butterfly friendly because nobody's using pesticides. That's rewilding in action. Please do it.
I think probably one of the biggest contributions that people can make in their daily lives is just to become informed consumers. You don't have to donate to a charity. It will be great. I mean, we always need money, and if you do donate to a charity that actually works on the ground, and that, which I think is pretty important. But if people are just more educated in their choices in their daily life, in terms of their clothing and the food and the transportation, I mean, there's so much. Frans mentioned, stop the unsustainable fishing and stop the unsustainable use. I mean, Africa, people are buying furniture in Europe, but it's coming from Africa. It goes to the Middle East or China, wherever it's manufactured there, but it's unsustainably deforestation here. The value is added in a totally different continent, and somebody else is buying it in another different continent. So do you understand the carbon footprint of the furniture that you buy, or the clothes, or the food? And I think just becoming an educated consumer on your just daily behavior of what you'll do will actually is probably one of the biggest contributions anybody can make, and it doesn't cost you money. So that will be probably, my advice is really just, become informed and understand the consequences of your actions. Which are actually quite devastating, and you probably, out of just pure ignorance, don't know.
Yeah, maybe to add on, and I mean, I fully support what both Vance and Werner said. You can do rewilding, and you can become engaged in rewilding, small, big, from your garden to estates to larger landscapes in many different ways. And I also really believe that consumer behavior is critical. There was a recent study done about the impact of meat. If people in Europe would eat less meat, and substantially less meat, huge amounts of land would become available, because 60% of the agriculture in Europe is basically to feed animals, cows and pigs, because it's grassland and it's cornfields. And imagine that if we eat less meat, what this impact would be in terms of land use change, because we need that land use change for nature to bounce back and create a healthy environment. So I would say, apart from your buying behavior, eat less meat, substantially less meat, and fly less. That's also a big one. So we get into all these advices. But when it comes to, linking up with Rewilding Europe, as I said before, we see huge interest in young generations, young career professionals. I think we have the opportunity to now help developing or growing a new generation of young people that are aware, want to change, already don't eat meat anymore because they know and understand, and create this new generation together with the older ones like us to show how you can do things in a different way, and that gives me lots of hope. I have two daughters myself, 22 and 23, and they look different at the world than we did in those days, of course, and this gives me most hope, and I really think the opportunity for us is to engage with these new generations that will shape the future together with us. And so for Rewilding Europe, please look at our website. Same for you, of course, Werner, for Peace Parks. But there's lots of things that we have put on the website how you can engage. So look forward to that.
Thanks. You. I have asked all of my questions, but I would like to open the floor if there's anything that you would like to add to the conversation, anything that you would like to discuss. I find this fascinating. The African perspective, the European perspective on this is really fascinating. So if there's anything that you would like to further discuss, please, the floor is yours.
Well, I think a nice one, because I have worked for over 15 years also in Africa and with Peace Parks and others in WWF when I was working, and also with African parks. And it's really interesting to make the comparison. A lot of people in Europe don't understand that we can learn a lot from Africa, and that's the case, because I've seen so many things that we're now using either as inspiration or an example. And one of those is, for instance, the more business approach to conservation. New financing models that have been developed in Africa, where Africa is decades ahead of Europe, where people think conservation is a public responsibility and not the private sector. So I think that's a big one. And of course, the what you call the wildlife industry. There's lots of wildlife management happening in South Africa in particular, but also other countries. And in Europe, we're just early days there, but big potential. And I think also the other way around. I think that Africa can learn from Europe when it comes to coexistence. This model of not separating nature and people, but actually trying to find ways to coexist, which is, of course, more difficult with lions than with wolves. I realize that and elephants. I realize that very much, but still, I think that's an interesting comparison to make. And I also have reflected on this quite a bit when starting Rewilding Europe. I also feel that what you said about population growth in Africa, we have gone through that process, and we went through this bottleneck of a huge increase of human populations, which has huge impact on our landscape and even lost species. I think for Africa, a big challenge is to also get safely somehow through this bottleneck. Don't lose species like we did, like the rhino and some of the others. Make sure they get through this bottleneck and then start recovering from there. And the biggest opportunity you have, and I've seen that in Southern Africa, where I've been traveling a lot, you have still vast landscapes that are physically untouched, where the water tables and the forest and there's no infrastructure, and basically the only thing you have to do is to bring the wildlife back. That's a movable asset. But if your landscape has been drained and cut with roads and whatever, then it becomes more difficult. So making sure that the physical environment is not harmed will give you in future, also the opportunity to restore and this is what has become very difficult in Europe. I guess you can imagine. So removal of infrastructure is a big thing for us, basically, if we want to rewild, and that's not easy and very costly. So a bit of reflection on Africa and Europe and what we can learn from each other.
Good. I'll just end up very quickly by thanking my friends and colleagues and thanking you, Lisa. Ambition, excitement, protect, restore, rewild. We can do it.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.